Monroe County, Michigan, December 5th, 1833. Monroe County, Michigan, December 5th, 1833. I write to you from a log cabin on the banks of the river Raisin, about 30 miles above Monroe. The worthy farmer upon whose premises I am quartered for the night sits with his child on his knee in the chimney corner, with a prosing visitor, pipe in mouth, opposite, while the good woman is engaged doing some chores at the farther end of the apartment, which is, of course, the chief cooking, eating, sitting, sleeping, and smoking chamber in the house. My dormitory, I have a shrewd suspicion, is to be in a loft, from which a lad is at this moment descending by a ladder with some corn for my horse. The black walnut stand, upon which I am writing, occupies the center of the room. And as I am at this moment keeping up my share in a desultory conversation going forward around me, and at the same time trying to check the undue familiarity of a large bulldog, who, like other individuals, has become troublesome from being admitted too rapidly into intimacy, you must not expect me to be very coherent in detailing the impressions of the day. It was a gloomy, lowering morning, with occasional flakes of snow driving through the harsh atmosphere, when I started from the village of Monroe, well mounted on a stout roan, whose figure and action would command thrice the sum in New York that the animal cost me here, and whose performance today speaks well of the dependence I may place upon him to carry me through my arduous route into the interior of the peninsula. It was with a feeling of almost boyish pleasure that, after the slight taste I have had of stagecoach traveling from Pittsburgh to Cleveland, and from Detroit to Monroe, I found myself once more in the saddle, with the full privilege of regulating my motions as I choose. The delightful mode in which I traveled with S from New York to Wheeling, in a barouche, with 2 led horses under the saddle, was indeed both for pleasure and solid comfort not to be surpassed. But now, though I have neither the agreeable friend, the attentive groom, nor the luxurious carriage to enhance the gratification and relieve the weariness of traveling, the feeling of independence still remains. And though I confess I could not suppress a sigh this morning when packing up my linen and books into my trunk which I shall not see for a month to come, I feel just as rich as that famous Soldato Dugald Dalgetty himself, with his single change of chamois, leather, and iron overcoat, what with my 1 change of shirt, my light fowling piece, and my leggings, which are drying upon those andirons. From the moment of leaving the village this morning, my road led along the banks of the Raisin, whose serpentine current flowed fuller and clearer the farther I advanced into the country, the land at the same time gradually rising, and though never hilly, yet leaving the stream far enough below to form a bluff of some 10 or 15 feet, where the timber land rose from the rich bottoms on its margin. After riding thus for about 20 miles along the river, where the log cabins gradually became fewer and farther between, I struck through a wood so dense that it seemed to terminate the settlements in this direction. And then, at a sudden turning of the path, I came at once upon the oak openings. It would be difficult to convey an idea of the pleasing effect of such a surprise. Imagine yourself emerging from a New Jersey swamp and coming at one bound upon one of the English parks, which Puckler Muskau so admirably describes. Clumps of the noblest oaks, with not a twig of underwood, extending over a gently undulating grassy surface as far as the eye can reach. Here, clustered together in a grove of tall stems supporting one broad canopy of interlacing branches, and there rearing their gigantic trunks in solitary grandeur from the plain. The feeling of solitude I had while in the deep woods deserted me the moment I came upon this beautiful scene, and I rode on for hours, unable without an effort to divest myself of the idea that I was in a cultivated country. Towards evening I found myself in the thick forest again, and was glad, as the night closed in darkly over the road where at every step my horse would either sink to his knees in mud or trip over the stubble of newly cut saplings, to be overtaken by a male rider with his leathern charge on horseback. The lonely lad was as glad of company through the forest as I was of a guide, and he willingly taking the lead, I flung my bridle on my horse's neck as the skies became blacker and blacker, and touching him smartly with the spur, away we went through the woods together. "Take care of that tree, sir. Look out for the mud hole," called my goblin usher at each moment, as we tramped and splashed along where I would have defied the evil one himself to have seen anything but the impenetrable dark. I heeded him not, but bending low in the saddle to avoid the boughs, I surrendered myself to my destiny, and attending to nothing but keeping my horse as close as possible to the heels of his file leader. At length we reached a clearing, and a few yards of better road brought us to a log cabin. The family were at supper when I entered, and, sitting down with the rest, I helped myself with an iron spoon from a dish of suppawn, and fishing up a cup from the bottom of a huge pan of milk, I poured the snowy liquid over the boiled meal that rivaled it in whiteness. The corn from which it is made, my host tells me, grew to the height of 16 feet, the stalks being of a blackish-green color. From the same soil, a black sandy loam of easy tillage, wheat as high as a man's head, has been raised, the produce from a single grain being from 300 to 400, and in one instance 1,026. I see symptoms of sleeping in those around me, and having no right to monopolize this important apartment, will conclude this elsewhere tomorrow. The cock loft, as I expected, was my place of rest. I stumbled over a pile of corn and struck my head against the roof, almost as soon as I had got my body fairly above the trap door. I found a clean bed, however, and it was a very sociable place after all, for there were 4 persons besides myself stowed away in the different corners. So soundly did I sleep on my straw pallet that the night seemed to me but just begun, when the red glare of a tallow candle flashing over my eyes, with the tap of the mail rider on my shoulder, told me that dawn was breaking and that we must be gone. The landlord brought out a lantern for me to mount by, and we had proceeded far on our journey before the faintest streak in the east indicated the waking of the sun. It was about 7 o'clock when, stopping to water at a little shanty, I found several laboring people at breakfast within, and, the mail carrier consenting to wait for me, I sat down at table at once with the rest. The fare consisted of hot rolls and tea, large slices of pork swimming in gravy, and a dish of mealy potatoes. My plate was heaped at once with all, while each one present vied with the others in civility to me. They were talking of a horse for which $100 had been paid when I entered, and an English poaching gun I have with me, not worth a fifth of the sum, caught the fancy of the owner. He insisted upon swapping with me on equal terms, and seemed much hurt when I refused not only to trade, but expressed no inclination to see his favorite steed. I replied, however, so good-humoredly to his entreaties that he still persisted in them until taken aside by 1 or 2 of those present. He then came up to me in an altered manner. "I hope, sir, that I don't insult you by wanting to buy that curiousest of guns, for I don't mean to be uncivil, not at all, in the least." Upon assuring him that I had taken no offense, he rejoined, that if his horse was not worth $200 he would eat him, but he had set his heart upon that gun and must have it. I did not like to expose myself to the temptation of seeing the horse, though of course I did not think for a moment of taking advantage of the honest yeoman's caprice. But had it not been a present from a friend abroad, I should certainly have given my ardent acquaintance the toy which caught his fancy after what followed. "I say, stranger," said he, musing for a moment, "do you want a farm, eh? A house, eh? I'll trade you as good a tavern stand 2 miles from this as there is in the county." I got away at last as he followed me to the door and held my bridle to mount, by promising to leave him the object of his desires in my will. The character of the country continued for some miles much the same as that passed over yesterday, though the river gradually degenerated into a narrow, muddy stream. The log cabins, which always occurred in the heavily timbered district, had nothing to distinguish them from each other, and the openings were as silent as if man and beast had deserted them, though I saw a couple of deer in one instance feeding afar off, and met a settler who was carrying a wolf, just caught in a trap by the roadside, on his shoulders. I was struck, too, at seeing no less than 3 pet fawns near different houses within a few miles of each other. In one instance a tall hound was sitting erect beside one of these gentle creatures who was licking the ears of the enemy of his race. The incident reminded me of an anecdote I heard told by an old hunter in one of the wild mountain districts of New York. His favorite hound one morning, when the deer were in the red coat and not fit to hunt, came to him while chopping and made signs for his master to follow to a thicket not far off, where the woodman discovered a fawn so entangled that it could not escape. It was so small and feeble that he carried it away with ease in his arms, while the doe, which was near at hand, followed her bleating offspring. The dog accompanied him with great apparent joy, and, though one of the keenest of his kind, would drive off the grown deer only a few rods, and then return at once to keep an eye on his master's movements. The fawn was taken home, and, being fed continually by the children, soon went tame about the house. The dog, however, insisted upon sleeping with it, and could scarcely be separated from his long-eared friend. And when it met with the usual fate of pets and died prematurely a month or 2 after, poor Ring was inconsolable. The worthy English settler, who had been a gamekeeper in the old country in his day, added that he had the curiosity to dress a piece of the venison, which, fond as hounds are of that food, was rejected with disgust by the canine mourner. One of the other fawns which I saw would, with the group attendant, have made a pretty subject for the pencil. He had thrust his head into a bevy of rosy little girls who were making sand peas on the bank of the river, and as his delicate hoofs threatened to demolish the rural substitutes for the card-houses of parlor-bred urchins, one of the little architects, covering her work with her hands, kept the intrusive animal at bay with her head, the long yellow locks of which streamed over his bluish crest, while the perverse beast twisted his snout under and insisted upon licking her face. It was still early in the afternoon when I arrived at this place, and my surprise was not slight after coming through a region where every mile seemed to lead me farther from civilization, to light suddenly upon a pretty village laid out with broad streets and having an excellent tavern on a public square in the center. I entered the town through an oak opening. Within a few hundred yards from the village I passed several graves apparently dug at random among the trees, though each was marked with a handsome tombstone. I have since learned that the town's people, with a degree of consideration which might well be emulated in larger cities, are already making arrangements to lay out and plant a public cemetery for the use of every religious denomination. At Monroe, I believe, they have already done the same thing. There, indeed, they had an ample number of guests for the narrow house, before even the abodes for the living were built. The bones of those massacred on the Raisin bleached till within a few years on the banks of that river, and an inhabitant of the place told me that he had often walked over the execution ground and handled skulls that were cloven with the tomahawk. There is also an Indian cemetery about 12 miles from Monroe, where the skeletons of the dead can be plainly seen through the crevices of the stone pile heaped above them. I am told that they are wholly unmolested by the white inhabitants, partly from feelings of decency creditable to themselves, and partly, perhaps, from fear of the roving relatives of the deceased, who return yearly and observe the condition of the spot with a jealous eye. Not far from this place resides an old settler who has killed half a dozen Indians with his own hand. 3 or 4 of them he shot with his rifle from his cabin when they surrounded it to capture him, and the stories told of his encounters with the others might better be detailed by a novelist than a letter writer. I have seen nothing of the natives yet except a couple of Wyandot squaws, though the French settlers, with their elf locks and blanket capotes, might at a distance be well taken for aborigines. I think a little of starting at once for the rapids of the Grand River and spending a week or 2 among the Ottawas, who, I am told, are still there in considerable numbers, and preserving enough of their original habits to make them fair specimens of the Michigan Indians. They tell me, however, that a guide will be indispensable, and having already offered one in vain a fair compensation, I may be compelled to give up the attempt. The Grand River, or Washtenaw, is, as I have before mentioned, the largest stream in the peninsula, being 270 miles in length, while the country watered by it consists of about 7,000 square miles. It has a good harbor at its mouth on Lake Michigan for vessels drawing 8 feet water, and it is navigable for those drawing 4 feet for more than 30 miles from the lake. While farther inland, it traverses a country represented by my informant, who has recently returned from surveying in that distant region, as of immense fertility. There are also beds of gypsum and lime, with stone quarries and mines of iron, with indications of the existence of copper to be found on its tributaries, while 100 mineral springs, which seem to abound in this country, for I have already seen half a dozen, enrich the central region where its branches interlock with the bright waters of the Huron on the eastern, and the myriads of streams and lakes which form the sources of the Kakalamazu on the western side of the peninsula. They tell me here that it would be in vain for me to attempt to cross the country from Chicago to St. Louis alone at this season of the year, when, if the vast prairies are covered with snow, I should be lost beyond a certainty. And, as I am now compelled to remain until the new public conveyance contracted for by government commences running on the 1st of January, I shall employ the intermediate time in seeing as much of Michigan as possible. But this is a comfortable vicinity. I find myself among the most intelligent population of the middle class, the bone and sinew of a community, and everyone seems so contented, I may even say delighted with his adopted home, so much so that I am catching a little of the spirit of those around me, and am eager to visit more intimate scenes, which one would suppose were Elysian, by the way, in which people talk of them. I find myself as yet only 35 miles from Monroe by the new United States road, though the route I traveled was 65. When you next hear from me, I shall be farther in the interior, and hope to be able to tell you that I have seen a hill or a rock, the sight of either of which would, I confess, be refreshing. In spite of all the charms of oak openings, vine-hung streams, and grassy bottoms.